This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The U.S. may soon sanction African countries that trade with Russia. A law to enable it do so has already passed the House of Representatives and is in the Senate. The Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act enjoys bipartisan support and is expected to sail through. Now couched as targeting malign Russian activities in Africa, the law shall oblige Washington to punish African governments with ties to Moscow. Leaders of the Southern African Development Community are already up in arms against the move. In a joint communique issued at the 42nd Ordinary SADC Summit in Kinshasa, the bloc's 16 member heads of state and government pushed back, accusing the U.S. of unfairly targeting Africa. Well, analysts and observers worry that the new U.S. anti-Russia strategy may reignite the Cold War divisions that saw Africa sharply split between the East and the West geopolitical blocs. High-profile visits by leaders of the Western world point to evidence of this renewed interest in Africa. Top diplomats, America's Antony Blinken and Russia's Sergei Lavrov, were recently both in Africa. So this week on the program, we examine the goals and timing of the new U.S. anti-Russia law, how Washington seeks to implement it, and the likely outcomes for Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, first, let's interrogate and try to understand the goals of this new U.S. law. Let me bring in our panelists today. From Johannesburg, Kofi Kwaku, Africa analyst at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. In Moscow, Professor Denis Dektirev, head of the Department of Theory and History of International Relations at the People's Friendship University of Russia. And in Washington, D.C., Professor William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the American University. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you for being a part of this discussion. First of all, Professor Lawrence, I want to get an understanding from all of you, though. The U.S. has proposed a law that seeks to punish African countries cooperating with Russia. Is the U.S. making Africa a theater of its contest with Russia?
No, I mean, in one sense, we have to acknowledge that Africa has always been a theater of international intrigue and conquest going back centuries. And there's no reason to see the situation now as different from what it was 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 150 years ago, in that the global powers often operate in the African space with disrespect for what the Africans want. So there's a history there, and I'm very cognizant of it. But this bill is not about sanctioning countries. It's not about reigniting the Cold War. If you get past the preambular language, which is what most of the media accounts are talking about, and you look at this bill, which is not a law yet, but you look at the bill, it's talking about Russian mercenaries and Russian war criminals. And it instructs the State Department to do a 180-day review, a 6-month review, to see how to counter them, both through positive actions, increased foreign assistance and other types of aid, and by sanctions if there's crimes going on. And Meeks, in his statement, the sponsor of the bill, only referred to Mali and Central African Republic, where we've had recent massacres involving Russian mercenaries. And there's also been references to Russian oligarchs who operate in the African space, trading use of these military actors in exchange for access to minerals. So we're talking about crimes. We're talking about plundering African resources in ways against African interests. It's not about sanctioning countries that trade with Russia, either in the body of the text or in the intent.
Professor Lawrence, we're going to get an understanding of what exactly that law says and the interpretation of the others. But first, Professor Dektirev, let me get your view on this, though.
I would say that I would place the contest not in, U.S.-Russia contest as during previous bipolarity, but now we have new bipolarity, Western countries and non-Western countries. And I would say that during last years, Western structural power in Africa is being questioned by emerging countries including Russia, especially in security sphere. And we would say that non-Western countries were rather successful in such countries like Mali, Chad, and some others. But we were successful in traditional security spheres. French military troops left Mali and are living from Central Africa. But now what we see, US and other countries, right, they are very strong in working with civil society. So it's not traditional, security issues. And they want to booster this civil society, right, in order to make anti-Russian sentiment among African population.
Kofi, let me get your thoughts.
The U.S. is literally at war with Africa by having this bill that supposedly has already passed Congress, and hopefully it's making its way to becoming a bill when it's signed by the president. Now, there's very important issues to take into account. It's not just to say we need to get past the language. Language is a very important expression of what we feel about something. And in this case, what is supposed to be a law later make sure that those Africans who are dealing with Russians will be punished. Let's not be sort of very diplomatic about the language. The bill is very clear. I mean, it's saying anybody doing business with Russian business people, Africans, will be in trouble. And if you want to couch this in a different language, I would say no. The reason why SADC leaders, African leaders in the Southern African development communities, have now voiced their concern is because of the consequences of that bill. Anybody can argue any other way. I mean, first of all, why even have a special bill against Africans doing business with Russians? Why not have a bill against Europeans doing business with Russians when we know there's plenty of Europeans that are doing business with Russians?
Professor Dektirev, is that your understanding as well, that it does not touch on matters of trade, that it is only about mercenaries?
Objective number one is about openness and open society. Objective number two is democracy and security dividends. Once again, if you are in the street of Bamako, it is very much anti-French, right, and a little bit pro-Russian, and they want just to change this spirit, right, of Malians, right, to make it more like anti-Russian, right, and pro-Western. For this, they will give like small grants to civil society, to small businesses, innovative businesses, etc., right?
So let
and
me rope in.
They will work mostly in Bamako.
All right, let me rope in Kofi here, because Kofi, you know, the U.S. clearly knows that it is not a single or neutral actor in Africa. Is the U.S. now using bully tactics to get Africa to pick a side in its geopolitical fights?
Yes, indeed. I think the bill itself really gives that feel, not just that feel, but the evidence that the U.S. is struggling to assert its influence. Not only that, by proxy France, written tons of stuff about that. The French are losing an enormous amount of reputational capital on the continent. Beside their old terrible colonial outcomes and all the things they've done, they haven't been able to really capitalize on the sort of post-colonial dividend. And Africans are now asking a lot of questions. And one of the biggest partners is the United States. So what that bill is doing, the bill is very clear. You know, there's no confusion about this. It's going to be passed over. There's, large gathering support on both sides in the United States. The context is saying, countering malign Russian activities in Africa. That's the context here. It's not in Europe, it's not in Asia, it's nowhere else. So that makes it, context governs meaning, clearly. So that meaning is that Africans doing business with Russians, it's not just malign Russian activities. These Africans will be also in trouble. We know that by associations, Africans will pay a large price. Why would the US do that to Africa?
Right.
When it's got a problem to deal with Russia? Deal with Russia. So in short, Africa now is slowly being transformed into a theater of engagement between the United States and its enemies, being China or Russia. And by proxy, Africans are caught in the middle. And saying that it's not yet clear that it's going to have an impact on Africans, I'm afraid to say no. It will have a terrific and detrimental impact on business in Africa.
Professor Lawrence, what sort of impact do you see this having in Africa? Because, you know, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did say in South Africa recently that sub-Saharan Africa is a major geopolitical force. What kind of impact do you see, you know, that bill having on the continent?
Well, that remains to be seen, and my colleague has said we've gone from the language is clear to context governs meaning. Now, the context does really matter. That over 2 centuries of foreign meddling in Africa in all kinds of ways that we can agree on, and there is this specter of the Cold War hovering over this, but. Don't forget, the Russia disinformation, which is very much affecting the discussion of this bill, is massive. If you go to Bamako right now, it's all Russian bots, Russian trolls, you know, Russian misinformation, trying to get Malians to turn against themselves. And that works in US elections, in European elections, and all over the African continent, the misinformation. And part of the goal of this bill is to address misinformation, not through sanctions, but to help strengthen resilience of institutions, including media institutions, against the misinformation. Now, the impacts won't be for another year or so, and the impacts all depend on what report the State Department gives and the recommendations it gives to Congress, and then Congress will try to fund those programs to counter the malign activities of Russia, not all activities of Russia, not all economic activities of Africans, but anything the Russians are doing that is against international law and against international norms on the continent. And I would expect this to be very targeted. So targeted towards a company, for example, that works with the Wagner Group, or a politician that works with a Russian entity that's involved in Ukraine. Those types of very targeted sanctions, not blanket sanctions against Africa or anything like that.
All right. I do want to hear from you, though, Kofi, because even as Antony Blinken says that, sub-Saharan Africa is a major geopolitical force, though, are African voices, though, heard in such issues such as who to trade with, for instance, where to place the sanctions, who to, agree with bilaterally, for instance? Are Africa's voices heard? Is Africa really a force here?
No, I mean, so far the Africans are struggling to be able to muster a force. I mean, if you took the communique that was issued last week by the Southern African Development Community leaders, it was really, while it was really, very significant, it's just a communique. There's nothing clear about what are they going to do about it. Are they lobbying in Washington? Are they asking for a specific thing through the African Union with Macky Sall, who's the chairperson of the African Union? And in fact, most of you already know that coming in December, there'll be a US-Africa summit. But before, we can't wait for this to happen. You need to have a lobbying people make their voices heard, not just on the African continent through a piece of paper, but a very concerted effort to make the Americans understand that these kind of bills that are supposedly going to be a law is a form of, in fact, I would call it a form of aggression towards African, who now are going to have to scramble to figure out how do we do business with Russia or anybody else. So every time, by extension, the United States comes out with its own law, it's sort of the law is reaching out much farther, way beyond the United States, to tell anybody by aggression, you can't do this, because if you did this, this is what's going to happen to you. And Africans are rightly so to be concerned, because we know these bills sometimes, not just they become something they become law, but there's always an evolution in this kind of bills and laws.
Right.
We've seen what happened to Libya, from saying we're going to have a no-fly zone to a bombing, campaign to destroy Libya, kill Muammar Gaddafi. And people are concerned that this might be the same. And I can tell you, it will be the same, because one thing is for sure, the continent, as everybody's noticing, is becoming a very important playground for the world tomorrow. So how do Africans with their voices, talking to Washington, making their voices known as well, make sure that this bill doesn't become law? It's a bad idea.
All right, gentlemen, we are going to take a short break on that note. But when we come back, we will unpack the historical ties between Russia and Africa, as well as find out whether this new law derives from America's Cold War mentality. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Well, let's continue with our discussion, and still with us from Johannesburg, Kofi Kwaku, Africa analyst at the University of Johannesburg. In Moscow, Professor Denis Dektirev, head of the Department of Theory and History of International Relations, People's Friendship University. And in Washington, D.C., Professor William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the American University. Professor Lawrence, if I may start off with you again, because the U.S. representative at the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, in a recent visit to Uganda, warned African countries that there were red lines they could not supposedly cross. What is the strategy here? What is Russia's strategy? How do you feel that the U.S. Perceives that whole question of crossing the red line?
Well, the U.S. red lines in Africa mostly have to do with terrorism. And now, if this law is passed, will have to do with a continent-wide look at how the Wagner Group and other nefarious Russian actors operate on the continent. In terms of Africa's, own perceptions of what's going on, they are free to trade with who they want or ally with who they want. It's just that those entities that want to work with war criminals therefore won't be able to trade with the United States. That's just an extension of, that side of the U.S. human rights agenda. I think Russia's interests are all over the place. They're dwarfed by, for example, Chinese interests and American and European interests on the continent. Russians have a much more limited interest and very much unlike the Cold War, which I don't think is really governing U.S. actions here. But the Russian interests are mostly about minerals and a certain amount of sale of arms, and then other sort of geostrategic objectives in a couple of countries. But if you look at the 55 countries of Africa, at any one time, the Russians are really active in only about 10 or 15. And increasingly, the most active Russian element is the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group, again, trading presidential and regime protections against mineral access. So this is the nexus the U.S. is trying to influence Africa on. Africans have every right to object. They have every right to lobby. The African lobby in Washington is quite strong. They could do more. But in this case, sanctions against group that work with war criminals or actually making war crimes, will be coming from the United States. And I think that's part of a proper human rights agenda.
Right. Professor Dektirev, let me get your view here. What is Russia's strategy according to you, and how does Russia view Africa?
I think that now we have power transit from US to China, and it will finish in around 15, 20 years when China will be much stronger than US. And Africa, of course, is not the major arena for geopolitical struggle. Major is in the Pacific, but Africa is also very important for US strategy of global containment of China and Russia. It's not, as my colleague from Washington said, is not the same as during the previous Cold War. So Russia is not promoting socialism and US capitalism or something else. Russia is a provider of sovereignty for many African countries, provider of sovereignty. It helps them to become sovereign. It helps them not to be dependent on collective neocolonialism of Europe and US, backed by US.
Kofi, African leaders have expressed dissatisfaction, about the way the United States has proposed the law and, about the continent being targeted. And they have reiterated that they should not be forced to take sides in international conflict where they were spectators. What's your response?
For once, at least, they've managed to spot something that could create an enormous amount of damage between them and their trading partners around the world. And they shouldn't be standing and staying there. There's a next step. convince and educate the United States that this posture, as I said again, is a bad idea. But it's not enough. They need to take more actions. They need to send people in Washington. They
Right.
need to engage Washington more and more, and then stop the bill from moving to the Senate, in fact. For centuries, the United States business model has been the business of war. And without that, the US cannot really survive. The connection between the military and business is very strong. While you have that business model, think about building the continent, having relationship that, at least as you always say, you want equal ways of partnerships to talk.
Professor Lawrence, African leaders do not want to take sides in international conflict where they are mere spectators. That is their sentiment. How do you respond to that?
They're not mere spectators. Tens of thousands of Africans got swept up in the Ukraine conflict. I was personally involved in getting Africans and North Africans in particular out of Ukraine, where they were stuck for months because they weren't properly evacuated. And African countries have taken various stands, in the UN votes, some for, some against, some neutral. But to say that the entire continent is a spectator is far from the truth. In fact, the treatment at the Polish border of African refugees was atrocious, and the U.S. personally intervened to help all of those Africans and to help repatriate them. In terms of one other point I'd like to make here, in this new sort of reconfigured Cold War that's going on, I wouldn't call it a Cold War. I'd call it strategic competition. With some actions against bad actors that the U.S. is focused on now. There is an ideological struggle taking place, and I would characterize it in the following way: do we want a sovereigntist illiberal order or a globalist liberal order? I.e., do we want putschist autocratic African countries supported by autocratic countries from outside of Africa, inflicting things on their populations in the name of sovereigntism, and you can't touch us because we're sovereign? Or do we want African nations to be part of global civil society, the global order, the global business, the global investment structure? The U.S. business model is business, it's not war. And the U.S. Interest here is to open up spaces for free enterprise, open up spaces for free expression, open up spaces for human rights, and allow Africans to participate fully in the global order. Nothing less. The U.S. doesn't do enough in the proactive way and should do more, and Africans should do more in Washington to push them in that direction. But to say here that somehow the U.S. wants to declare war on Africa or prevent Africans from doing anything is really the opposite of what's going on.
Kofi, this is a very interesting topic here because the U.S. is calling this a strategic competition.
Yes, whatever strategic competition we call it, and I think Professor Lawrence put his finger on. We can't. I mean, it could be also almost a duplicitous language, as I said in my piece. Secretary Blinken saying he said in perfect French the last time he was here in Johannesburg, saying that we're not engaging back in Africa because of any other country. But that's not right. I want to use the term strategic here. That's what I call in my article, strategic lying. What we're looking for is the language and the action that follows the language must be healthy and help Africa, as China just did this week, right, for giving 23 loans to African nations. We haven't heard the United States doing that. If we have, as Africans, we have the feeling that they're not helpful, then we're very concerned that you may be using the right sweet talking language, but you're not really helping us.
SADC leaders say they will propose a non-alignment policy on international wars at the AU. What is Africa's position, though, on matters such as what we're talking about, and especially when they're caught in the middle?
Africans are tired of wars and conflict that really meddling, global powers meddling into its present, future, and everything else. We have so many challenges, which I call the horsemen. There are about 4 of them. Poverty, inequality, unemployment, crime. I mean, the list goes on and on. So if there's meddling from outside, it doesn't matter whatever Africans can put themselves to organize their own strategies. I mean, I'm writing another piece called Summiting Africa. There's summits about Africa, US Africa, Germany Africa, EU Africa, Japan Africa, China Africa. But Africa doesn't have something around it for itself to determine. However, One important point is the African Union Vision 2063. Of course, it does have its problems, but at the basis of it, what governs this is to say a continent that's looking for some kind of peace to be able to develop. And we know if there are too many conflicts, and we've seen with Professor Dekterev in Mali, which I've covered also,
Right.
if there's instability, there is no peace. And these two go together because they're brothers.
Professor Dekterev, if this does become law, what can we expect in your view?
The US will mix, as it happened in Syria, they will mix like democratic opposition with jihadists, and they will overthrow governments of many African countries who want to select a strategic alternative, who looks towards China or towards Russia. So that's what will happen. But I don't completely agree with Kofi that Cold War is bad, right? In fact, if you will compare what happened during Cold War and in 1990s, you remember there were a lot of conflicts in 1990s, right? For example, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and then what happened in Great Lakes region. It all happened in 1990s when there was no bipolar world, but unipolar world. So America was a hegemon, but it even being very strong, it has not enough forces to solve all problems around Great Lakes, etc., etc. So I think that in some way, Cold War or bipolarity is probably more fruitful, right? In what way? It gives a strategic alternative. Any country could choose, right, what with whom to align with, either with West or non-West countries. Yeah.
Professor Lawrence, you have the final word. And if this does become law, what can be expected?
Well, that's the definition, what was just said, of a Cold War mentality. It is true that bipolarity in certain respects might be better than unipolarity, but where we want to end up is multipolarity with a strong Africa. And I'm entirely in favor of the Africans pointing out their objections to this law, pointing out their objections to any sanctions, so that anything that is done is very targeted and takes African points of view into account. If this bill is enacted, which it will be likely, because the Senate will probably go the same way as the House, we'll see that 6-month study period again, during which the Africans can have their say, including the African caucus within the U.S. Congress, and as it can influence the executive branch of the U.S. government, including through the National Security Council, which they talk to Africans every day there, and then we'll have some sort of articulation of actions on the continent, both on the positive side and on the sanctions side, to try to reduce the foreign meddling of Russia in Africa in nefarious ways that works against African interests, and that doesn't cross any red lines that the Africans have. And that's what we're hearing from Kofi and others. There need to be some African red lines here, and I'm okay with those African red lines.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for that discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts in Johannesburg, Kofi Kwaku, Africa analyst at the University of Johannesburg. In Moscow, Professor Denis Dekterev, head of the Department of Theory and History of International Relations, People's Friendship University of Russia. And in Washington, D.C., Professor William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the American University. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. To join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.